We would now like to ask Mr. Christian Oesch to present his initiative. He had written to the US Health Minister and asked for help in light of the persecution of doctors here in Germany. And we look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
When criticism becomes a crime, the treatment of government critics in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank you for the invitation. I thank the AfD faction and especially Dr. Rainer Rothfuss and the working group 17 for the opportunity to speak here today. I come from Switzerland. That has an advantage. You can view the political debates in Germany with a certain distance. And sometimes you see things more clearly from the outside than from the inside. Therefore, I would like to start with a small honesty. I will not deliver a final judgment on the Bianca Witschel case today. I am not a German citizen. I do not know every file here. But and I consider it presumptuous when foreigners believe they can judge every individual German case. But I can speak about something else, about a pattern. The Witschel case is not an isolated incident. It is part of a development that can now be observed in many Western countries. More and more often, the following happens. Criticism of the government is not addressed politically. It is handled legally. It is investigated, it is reported, it is searched. And at some point, the question is no longer whether his arguments are valid or whether his existence poses a problem. This is a remarkable development for societies that consider themselves liberal democracies. In a democracy, something entirely different should actually happen. Someone voices criticism, followed by a debate, argument meets counter-argument, and in the end, the public decides which position is more convincing. At least that's the ideal. But when criticism is increasingly handled through courts, public prosecutors, and investigations, something fundamental changes in the political climate. Then a political debate slowly turns into a security issue. And it is precisely at this point that it becomes very dangerous for a democracy. To understand why this happens, we need to take a step back. There was once a time, not so long ago, when political narratives could be relatively easily controlled. The public obtained their information from just a few sources, such as newspapers, television, and news agencies. And precisely because of this, large media houses and their backers, perhaps now one could list them as the Epstein Syndicate, had enormous power over political narratives for decades. And this power had a network. This power had an interesting side effect. Whoever controls the narrative no longer really has to deal with criticism. They can simply make it invisible or more modernly put, label it as disinformation. This order functioned surprisingly stably for decades. Then came the internet. Suddenly anyone could publish. Suddenly new information spaces emerged that lay outside the classic media hierarchy. And this is precisely where a tectonic shift in the political system began, because power does not voluntarily relinquish communication control. When narratives can no longer be reliably controlled, power structures typically respond in two ways. First, they try to control the platforms. Second, they try to discipline the dissidents. We observe both today. Laws against so-called disinformation, pressure on platform operators, algorithms that determine what is visible and what is not. And parallel to this, we see something else. Searches because of tweets, investigations due to expressions of opinion, court cases because of political criticism. A Swiss lawyer was recently asked whether Switzerland is still a state governed by the rule of law. His answer was dry and quite sobering. A state governed by the rule of law is a state where the state is always right. That initially sounds like a play on words, but it describes a development that many citizens now feel. When law is no longer understood as the protection of the citizen, but as an instrument of power, the relationship between the state and society fundamentally changes. Because then the perception of the citizens also changes. Then more and more people no longer ask, is this argument correct? But rather, is one even allowed to express this argument anymore? And this is probably exactly the point where every person has a responsibility. When narratives are presented to us today, political narratives, media narratives, we should ask ourselves a simple question. Does this actually correspond to my own observation of reality? Every person possesses their own judgment, the ability to assess whether what they are told aligns with their own reality. If this ability is lost, something arises that psychologists sometimes call paramorality today. People no longer adopt moral positions out of their own conviction, but due to social pressure. A concrete example from Switzerland shows how quickly such mechanisms can take hold. We choose the former Swiss intelligence officer Jacques Beau, NATO advisor, employee of the Swiss Intelligence Service and the United Nations, publicly analyzed the Ukraine war. His problem was not a lack of expertise. No, his problem was that his analysis partially reached different conclusions than the official political narratives. As a result, the European Union placed him on a sanctions list. The justification is pro-Russian propaganda. Concrete evidence was never really presented to the public or to him. Now one could say, Switzerland is a sovereign state and decides for itself which sanctions it adopts. And indeed, Switzerland did not officially adopt this sanction against Jacques Beau, but practically it affected him. Recently, the major bank UBS blocked all bank and credit cards for Jacques Beau without warning. His accounts were blocked, his pension was no longer transferred. The official reason given is that banks are allowed to take stricter measures for reputational and risk reasons than the state. In other words, even if a sovereign state does not impose sanctions, financial institutions can still effectively enforce them. This raises a fundamental question. Since when do banks stand above the law of a sovereign state? A particularly revealing comparison makes this imbalance clear. The already convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein was able to use UBS banking services for a long time. But a former intelligence officer loses them because of a geopolitical analysis. That shows which interests are actually protected and which are not. When you combine these cases, you recognize a pattern. Doctors come under pressure when they deviate from official guidelines. Analysts come under pressure when their assessments do not fit the political narrative. And financial institutions are beginning to enforce political sanctions, even when national laws do not require it. And this is where it gets really interesting, because these developments are happening not only in Germany and not only in Switzerland. You find them in many Western countries simultaneously. This raises a crucial question. Who coordinates this development? Is it the parliament? Is it the national governments? Or are we increasingly experiencing the influence of transnational power structures? A network of international organizations, financial institutions, large technology corporations, and political decision makers. Structures with enormous economic and communicative power, but also only limited democratic control. And therefore, today you hear from the mouth of a Swiss person something that perhaps not everyone expects. Switzerland is not the land where milk and honey flow and freedom is automatically guaranteed. We too are under the same political, economic, and institutional influences as the rest of Western Europe. Our podpisky Anyone who seriously deals with power structures and who has truly studied cases like that of Jeffrey Epstein begins to understand that influence in our world is often organized quite differently than described in textbooks on democracy. Networks cross borders, financial systems cross borders, influence crosses borders, and therefore, today in Western Europe, there is probably no real Gallic village left that is completely outside of these structures. Even here in Switzerland, the traces of the Epstein syndicate are unmistakable. Unfortunately, this is the uncomfortable reality, but this is precisely where our opportunity begins, because power has a major disadvantage. It only functions smoothly as long as its mechanisms remain invisible. The moment people begin to understand how power actually works, it loses part of its greatest advantage. Insight creates clarity, clarity creates courage, and courage creates change. That is why my speech does not end with pessimism, but with a simple insight. Only when one recognizes who exercises power and how it functions, does one stop being deceived by it. More than 2,000 years ago, Plato warned, the penalty for not participating in politics is being governed by worse people. The challenge of our time is therefore simple and yet difficult. Not to look away, not to remain silent, and not to hope that others will solve this problem. Because freedom is not a gift from the state, freedom is not a privilege distributed by the governments. Freedom is the natural right of every person from birth. The Roman political philosopher Cicero once put it this way: freedom does not consist in having a good master, but in having none. And perhaps that is exactly the point. Freedom begins the moment when people have the courage to trust reality more than the narrative. And perhaps some power structures fear exactly that. Not criticism, but self-thinking people who begin to understand. Because when people understand how power works, then power suddenly doesn't work as well anymore. So, beauty. And perhaps this also explains why doctors in particular come under pressure in such times. Because doctors are part of a special tradition. Their first standard is not the narrative, but the well-being of the patient. Their first standard is not the political line, but their medical conscience. And that is precisely why people with a conscience have always been a problem in all totalitarian systems. Because conscience cannot be commanded, and that is precisely why it is crucial that these cases do not remain hidden. In Germany and Switzerland, an initiative is currently emerging that is attempting exactly that. Under the project Doctors with Conscience, cases of doctors who have come under pressure because of their conscience are being documented. This project, which is being developed among others by Peter Pickel in the environment of MWGFT, has a clear goal: to make visible what has so far been portrayed as an isolated case. So if you are interested, ärzte-mit-gewissen.org. Only when something had to become visible could the process of coming to terms begin. And I can tell you this development is not limited to Europe. I myself am currently having intensive discussions in the United States in the circle of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., where similar considerations are being made to document such cases internationally. Because the problem is not national, it is structural, and therefore it also requires an international response. Because if these voices are not documented, then they will be forgotten. And if they are forgotten, then what happened will repeat itself. Thank you for your attention.